Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Paranormal Now. Filling in for me this past Tuesday was guest host Dr. Rita Louise, and she interviewed Nick Redfern. It's a fascinating conversation, and I can think of no one better to interview Nick than Rita. She's been on the show before. She is a fantastic person with a wonderful personality, a great breadth of knowledge of the paranormal, and it turned out that their conversation really was interesting. They covered everything from conspiracy theories, modern old COVID, ET, extraterrestrial, disclosure, monsters, cryptids, what have you, the whole gamut. So I think you'll really enjoy this episode. Also, something to keep in mind coming up next weekend on May 30th is the All the Strange virtual online expo. No, this is not a paid endorsement. I'm just giving these guys a plug because I think it's going to be really cool. So if you want to check it out, go to allthestrange.com. It's run by Rogue Planet and Ryan Sprague of Somewhere in the Skies. So that's a really interesting event. And I'm just so glad that so many people are doing these free online events, at least for now. I mean, eventually, yeah, of course, when you do expos and these sort of things, it takes a lot of effort and work, and people do need to get paid to some degree if possible. But right now, I think the more sensitive thing to do is to not do that. But that's just my personal opinion. So if you want to go and check that out, that's May 30th next weekend, allthestrange.com to register. All right, I hope you enjoy this episode of Paranormal Now with Dr. Rita Louise and Nick Redfern.
Something strange is happening on May 30th. Rogue Planet presents All the Strange 2020, a virtual online expo highlighting and celebrating UFOs, extraterrestrial life, ghosts, Bigfoot, all the strange. Join us on May 30th as we showcase a series of fun presentations delivered by a lineup of awesome humans who are fascinated by the strange. And get this, All the Strange 2020 is a 100% free event. So jump over to allthestrange.com and register now.
And welcome to Paranormal Now. I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and I am filling in for Alan B. Smith this week and going to host the show. Today we're going to be talking about mainstream media, what mainstream media would label conspiracy theories. What makes for a good conspiracy? There's an event that happens, but somewhere a difference of opinion forms, one leading to social acceptance and the next to what is labeled as a fringe idea spouted by a bunch of kooks, myself included, regardless of the amount of evidence support for the opposite opinion. So we're talking about things like JFK and ghosts, UFOs, and the list of things that fall under the umbrella of conspiracy theories is enormous. And especially these days, which we're going to get into, it just seems like conspiracy theories are afoot. So to help us understand and unravel some of what's been going on for a very, very long time, we are going to be speaking with Nick Redfern. So Nick is a full-time author and journalist specializing in a wide range of unsolved mysteries, including Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, UFO sightings, government conspiracies, alien abductions, and the paranormal. See, a good fit for this topic. He writes regularly for the London Daily Express newspaper, Fortean Times, Fate, and UFO magazine. His previous books include, and this is the very, 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 very modified list, Three Men Seeking Monsters, Strange Secrets, Cosmic Crashes, and the FBI Files. Among his many exploits, Nick has investigated reports of lake monsters in Scotland, vampires in Puerto Rico, werewolves in England, aliens in Mexico, and sea serpents in the United States. So please welcome to Paranormal Now, my good friend, Nick Redfern. Hey, Nick.
Oh, hey, Rita. How's it going?
It's good. It is just so nice to hear your voice. It's just been a really long time since we've talked.
Yeah, it
Since
has. Probably, I don't know, 8, 9 months, a year, maybe, something like that. I'm not sure.
Well, but we haven't. I mean, we used to travel on the same circuit when there were a lot of conferences going on. And then when I had my show, Just Energy Radio, you were, kind of a permanent fixture because you are so prolific and your material is great. And it's topics that I like talking about, the weird and unusual that for some reason always ends up being some weird conspiracy theory. I don't know about how that ends up happening. But I wanted to start because there's so much going on that I wanted to start the interview talking about what's going on in the world today. We have, and I'm just going to throw out a whole giant list at you, and I'll let you pick where you want to go and where you want to start. Because we have what's going on with the COVID virus. Was it a lab-made phenomena or was it natural? The reportings that we're getting from the government as far as the testing is going. And, I saw this one post on Facebook that said, man was eaten by an alligator but died from COVID-19, which made me laugh. So there's the whole pandemic piece that we're in the middle of. But then we also have what's going on with the government, with like the FISA documents being released and all of this political stuff coming to the forefront. And actually, even thrown in the middle of that, also, I've started seeing news footage, like fairly recent news footage, of people going on like Fox and CBS talking about UFOs are real, which made me kind of stare at the television set like, when did that happen? So I know I kind of threw a bunch out at you, so go.
Well, yeah, I mean, if we sort of go backwards, I guess, the whole thing of sort of UFO revelation and footage and, what amounts to reports from highly credible military personnel, which are now coming to the fore, and which is something you would not have seen sort of 10, 15 years ago. And what you also wouldn't have seen 10 or 15 years ago is the scenario of the whole thing being taken extremely seriously, but not just by ufology, but also by the mainstream media. And I mean, if you look back sort of, well, you'll know, I mean, 20, 25 years ago, you talk about UFOs, people would kind of like, kind of snigger, sort of a,
You're a weirdo. UFO weirdo.
Exactly. Or, you kind of, they walk back away from you a little bit, you sort of like the local town eccentric, that kind of thing, which I don't mind being the local town eccentric, by the way. But what I would say is that there's no doubt that there's been an incredible change in terms of the trends and the approach to the UFO subject. And certainly largely it began, I would say, towards the end of 2017, around about Christmas, when the whole story broke with the New York Times that the US government had got this secret UFO program, which nobody knew about. And of course, for years, we've been told that the US government had closed down its UFO programs back in 1969 when they shut down Blue Book. But it turns out that that actually wasn't the situation. There was this sort of carefully and secretly funded program to sort of look up things at in the modern era. And I think what was most important, to sort of go back to the media, was the fact that the story was not just sort of opened up through the New York Times, but when that story broke, you had everybody like CNN and MSNBC all following the story, but more importantly, following the story extremely seriously and interviewing people on the mainstream news, in the same way that they would be following a political story or something else, So I think we've seen in the last few years a very welcoming situation where it's actually not a weird thing to be into UFOs, and the fact that the media are covering this whole issue seriously, I think that's kind of put us into sort of a new realm that was totally different to, say, the late 80s, 90s or whatever.
Would you say that this information being broadcast on the news would be equated to, and I'm just going to say disclosure, or the people that are waiting for disclosure, are they waiting for the government to come out and say, oh yeah, UFOs are real?
Yeah, well, it's always difficult to say. I mean, over the years, I have to admit that I was not sort of a fan of disclosure. And the main reason why I wasn't was because I'd sort of seen this many times before. The truth's coming. President Reagan, when he talked in the mid-'80s, that if we all joined together, and faced an alien threat, we would all come together as one sort of civilization. Reagan talked about that quite a lot, sort of 1985, 86. And all that time, I was only a kid back then, but I remember, because some of the magazines I subscribed to, people were saying, this is going to open up the story, but it didn't. And I've heard, other occasions that, disclosures around the corner, it's going to arrive next Thursday or something like that. And it never does. But I have to admit that I have sort of lessened up a little bit on the cynicism. And I do sometimes wonder now that what we are seeing could be a kind of subtle disclosure. Now, we're not obviously seeing, a major leading world leader, standing up before the world and saying, okay, we're going to show the evidence that, yes, aliens are real, we've got the evidence, etc., etc. We're not exactly seeing that. But what we are seeing is data, and quite extraordinary data when you talk about footage as well. It does make me wonder, is this just being released because it's cool material and the government thinks we might like to see it? Or are we seeing more of a subtle disclosure? Not like, as I said, you have a president or a prime minister or a queen or a king, saying this is what we've got and here it finally is. We're not seeing that, but we are seeing sort of like a subtle, slow development of releasing a little bit here and then next week another thing, a month after that, some footage surfaces. So I have to think now that maybe there is some sort of agenda by the release. In other words, it's not just the government thinks it's all this cool and we like to see it because it's exciting. I actually think there could be some kind of agenda to acclimatize us more and more to the idea of a UFO phenomenon.
And that makes a lot of sense. Even 20 years ago, if you told somebody that you did ghost hunting, they looked at you like you were crazy. And as you know, I live in Podunk, East Texas, and I've said to people, oh yeah, I've done ghost hunting. And they're like, really? Tell me about that. Oh, and they have all of these questions and all of this interest now where it's not taboo. And it just makes me wonder, with this material coming out in the news, is it making it be less taboo so that people can own it and just have it really be kind of part of their lives?
Well, I mean, it's interesting you should say that because, we're sort of focusing on UFOs, but I mean, I've seen exactly the same kind of thing where, for example, things like the Loch Ness Monster, new sightings and reports are actually, again, taken quite seriously, by the media. So, now I don't believe personally that the media is in the combined media of the entire planet is sort of got together and said, we're going to get all this information out there. I don't believe that at all. I think a lot of it just comes down to it sells newspapers. But what I would say, there's no doubt that there's been a trend in the last few years have taken these kind of subjects seriously, whereas 20 years ago, people would be saying, you need to be in the nut house or whatever, And so, in that sense, it's a welcome situation. The big question, is it the start of some degree of disclosure, or is it just opening up the files because so many people today are interested in these things, or could it be a combination of the two? And I think one of the important things is to note with government agencies, very often Agency B doesn't know what Agency C does, and nobody knows what Agency A does, and that's how secrecy is kept, because different agencies essentially hide material from other agencies. Very often it's a case that this organisation, that organisation, they don't always work together, and that's sort of like a little known thing. So we could be we could be looking at possibly one agency that handling all of this, and the others are thinking, well, hang on a minute, we weren't told about that, so they try and figure out what's going on. So there could be multiple levels of secrecy surrounding UFOs. And when that story surfaced in late 2017, and, the revelation of the UFO program, well, it wouldn't surprise me if there were, say, 4 or 5 other UFO programs still hidden away, maybe one run by the CIA, one run by the Navy, and so on and so on. So I think it's possible that there could even be competing factors within government, some who want the story to get out, and some who are like, hell no, we cannot tell the people this. So I think, it's when we think of the government, it's not like a unified entity. It could be like, sort of multiple agencies trying to figure out what should we do with this UFO presence.
I'm joking here, but, with ghosts being okay and UFOs being okay, and, pretty soon Bigfoot's going to be okay, and, ancient aliens are okay, we're not going to have anything to write about.
I never thought about that. Well, in a way, you're right. I mean, everything, I think people thrive on mysteries, and when everything becomes legitimized, it's like, oh, well,
Been there, done that, got the T-shirt,
yeah,
don't need to read your book.
Yeah, exactly. But you make a good point there. I mean, we're on the way, I think, where the abnormal and the unexplained is quickly becoming the accepted, and the normal. And that's why you see so many TV shows, on paranormal topics, because they're so popular. And I think more than anything else, we are seeing a development in trends. And of course, there's 2 ways of looking at it, particularly when it comes to TV. One is that so many of these channels jump onto the bandwagon because they see all the other shows on UFOs and Bigfoot are really popular, and their figures are really high. So there's definitely that part to it as well. But I also think there is a section of this whole phenomenon of TV and media and the paranormal where people, in society today are just far more open than they were 25 years ago, 20 years ago. That literally is what it comes down to, I think.
Okay. All right, I'm going to kind of transition, although stay on UFOs, and kind of dig into your book a little bit. But this is going to be a rough transition. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Nick's new book, Assassinations, the Plots, Politics, and Power Behind History-Changing Murders. But, so this is...
That was good.
Huh?
I said I like that. That was good.
Oh, thank you. So
welcome.
it's kind of my transition piece. Because they just unveiled the new Space Force, which I don't really know what they're supposed to be doing, so you might have some insights on that. But then tied to it, was the death of, okay, I wrote his name down, Thomas Falzarano, who was the commander of the 21st Space Wing, so of this new Space Force. Mm-hmm. And of course, he died a natural death.
Yeah.
Right. Natural causes. And it seems like, and I'm going to kind of back the question out a little bit, although if you could talk about the Space Force a little bit, I'd appreciate it. That when you talk about UFOs and extraterrestrials, there seems like there's a lot of assassinate or people that die of mysterious causes.
Mm. Well, I mean, in terms of the whole sort of, Space Force and warp speed, and all this kind of thing with the virus, what we're seeing is kind of like the usage of, famous words and phrases out of the world of sci-fi. But it's a fact. If you look back throughout history, you can find a lot of projects and programs that were very ambitious in relating to getting to outer space. For example, in the 1960s, the U.S. military, actually the U.S. Army, planned to put astronauts, on the surface of the moon. Now, this program was highly classified at that particular time, and but it was at the same time that NASA was planning on sending their astronauts to the moon. And the NASA astronauts were going there to sort of, understand the nature of the moon itself. It was like a scientific angle. As far as the whole issue of putting people on the moon, as far as the U.S. Army was concerned, it was very much sort of creating like a strategic outpost in any event that was sort of like a Third World War. And if our missiles were taken out, with sort of a continent-to-continent basis, we could at least launch missiles from like a final response, if you like, from the moon down to the Earth. And over the years, there have been rumors of secret bases on the surface of the moon and things like this. One of them, a guy who actually worked in the Air Force and came forward, named Carl Wolf, a number of years ago, Wolf with an E on the end, who came along and spoke about his knowledge of sort of secret bases on the far side of the moon, because a lot of people may not know that whereas, our planet sort of orbits in a circular fashion, we only actually ever get to see the one side of the moon, the far side. We never ever see it. That's just how the orbit of the moon and the Earth are. But we've got those situations, and as I mentioned earlier, President Reagan was heavily into UFOs, warned about UFO attacks and things like that. But he also was the guy who got everything going with the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, or as it was more famously known as Star Wars. And the idea was to create sort of an arsenal of laser-based weapons that if the Russians launched a sneak attack on the West, we could literally sort of like bang, 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 one of each, just blow each one out of the sky. And before the missiles could reach, say, Germany, France, the US, Australia, wherever, So, in other words, what we're seeing today, with the whole issue of creating like a sort of space force, there's nothing new about this, and primarily it sort of is focused around two areas. One is sort of the angle of a strategic defense if something was to happen on the planet, and the major military bases on in the States got taken out. At least we would have an ability to respond from the moon. But also, you've got the angle of discovery and looking into the mysteries of outer space. And, I think people are sort of looking at Mars, and things like this. So, it's interesting times when you've got all these different kinds of programs that have, whether it goes from some sort of space force or back to Reagan's angle or back in the early 60s with the US military. it's clear that people within government are very intrigued and sort of fascinated by the idea of sort of looking how space can be sort of militarized or weaponized or even.
Uh-oh. Did we lose you, Nick?
No, I'm still here. I just finished the sentence.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I had to take a breath.
Okay. Oh, man. But it was just so interesting. And I've heard some people say that, like China, for example, they have a bunch of satellites out there that can look down and actually do facial recognition from, satellites, which is like, oh my God. It makes you want to wear your mask all the time so they can't tell who you are.
Well, I'll tell you what, for a lot of nations, and you don't hear too much about this unless you sort of actually know what it means and what the implications are. One of the most disturbing aspects of a potential third world war, or just just a strike out of the blue, something like that, excuse me, is the issue of the grid, if you like, being taken out, and this revolves around what are called electromagnetic pulses. And the idea, well, not the idea, it's a reality, is that EMP weaponry can quite literally sort of take anything out, that has any kind of electronic component to it. And so electromagnetic pulse weapons, basically, why it's disturbing and worrying is that these devices could actually be inserted into space satellites orbiting the world, and which seem to be just regular satellites, maybe, just sort of recording and watching the weather and things like this. And some of them may be spy satellites. But there's a big fear within the intelligence community that the Chinese or the Russians might have EMP weapons inserted within what appear to be regular satellites, but they may actually, when orbiting over the planet, release their weaponry, and that would be these EMP weapons. Now, EMP weapons.
We need to. Hey, Nick. Psst. We need to go to break.
Oh, okay.
So I'm Dr. Rita Louise. You're listening to Paranormal Now. We're talking to Nick Redfern about his book, Assassinations, the Plots, Politics, and Power Behind History-Changing Murders. And we'll be back after these words from our sponsors.
Something strange is happening on May 30th. Rogue Planet presents All the Strange 2020, a virtual online expo highlighting and celebrating UFOs, extraterrestrial life, ghosts, Bigfoot, all the strange. Join us on May 30th as we showcase a series of fun presentations delivered by a lineup of awesome humans who are fascinated by the strange. And get this, All the Strange 2020 is a 100% free event. So jump over to allthestrange.com and register now.
Now you have the inside contact for alternative talk radio. The Planet. KGRAradio.com.
Lost in a bad way, cost me my family. Chaos around me, can't hear my heart say, hey, that's the wrong way. Hey, that's the wrong way. Hey, that's the wrong way. That's the wrong way.
And welcome back to Paranormal Now. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise. I'm filling in for Alan B. Smith. And if you want to find out more about me, you can go to my webpage, soulhealer.com. So we've been talking to Nick Redfern about, well, we haven't really got too much to his new book, but we're talking about it now. Assassinations, the Plots, Politics, and Power Behind History-Changing Murders. Bah, bah, bah. See, I think it needs to have a sound effect every time I say murders, Nick. But so this is where I want to go. I kind of wanted to throw this in earlier, but the UFO conversation was just too good. But what's required to have a good conspiracy? If we're being told the truth and the whole truth, then who or where is this disinformation coming from and why? Because it seems like there's the party line of what we hear, and then there's this whole other chunk of material that comes from somewhere. End of question.
Well, I mean, that's actually a good point. How does a conspiracy, and particularly sort of surrounding an assassination or a murder, how does it happen? Well, I mean, I actually think it's quite simple. I mean, if you look at somebody gets murdered and it seems to be black and white and straight, and and it seems to be that's all it is, then chances are, there really isn't a conspiracy. But there are some cases where when you start looking into them, you find numerous weird threads and connections that suggest maybe something else was going on. I mean, for example, a perfect example, kind of typical and inevitable, would be the Jfk assassination. Now, we know that, as far as the government's concerned and the Warren Commission, they concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald was the guy who just killed JFK and did it all alone. But the more you look into it, you find the fact that Oswald was allowed to leave the US to go to Russia, the Soviet Union as it was then, and he got permission to come back, and his wife, had relatives who worked in the field of Soviet intelligence of all sorts of things. And, then you look at the sheer number of people who died under mysterious circumstances who were connected in some ways to the JFK assassination. It's situations like that you start to see there's some degree of conspiracy, purely and simply because of the sheer number of people involved and the connections and the links. And a lot of people may not realize, that Lee Harvey Oswald was never charged and, convicted, of President Kennedy's assassination. JFK was shot on the Friday. The Saturday, of course, all hell was, just going crazy. And then the next day, Oswald was dead. So, in other words, the whole thing seems far too tidy for me. You've got this one man claiming to be a patsy, and he was sort of being presented as the assassin when he wasn't, and then we find out he'd been to Russia, and then we find out that it was, just had it seamlessly trip right back into the United States with his wife, as I said, whose family were involved in Russian intelligence. And then you've got connections to Russia and the mafia, the mob. And so that is really what makes a conspiracy, is when the picture really expands to incredible degrees, rather than just it being black and white. Okay, he pointed the gun, he shot, he did it,
Mm-hmm. But I think it's interesting. One of the comments that you made was that, Oswald was never tried, but it doesn't seem like in their there wasn't an investigation. There was the Warren Commission that investigated it, but there really wasn't an investigation at the time of the shooting, not that I recall.
Well, the problem with the Warren Commission was that it just left out so much material. And when you read it carefully, which I have, it's clear that certain data was not just left out, but it almost seems as if it was deliberately left out. And it, whether or not the U.S. government as an entity actually knew who shot JFK and why, that's sort of an interesting question in itself. People ask me, do I think the U.S. government killed JFK? Well, my answer is no, I actually don't. What I do believe is that a cabal of people got together, which may have involved like the mafia, the mob, the Cubans, intelligence agencies, Russia. It could have been a situation where so many people wanted him gone, and in an almost unique situation, and possibly on the only time ever, they all got together, kind of like in a group situation. You want him gone, we want him gone, they want him gone. We might be, worst of enemies, but let's work together to get rid of this one person. And so I think that might explain why there seems to be connections between JFK and the mafia and the Russians and the KGB and the Cubans and so on and so on. And I think sometimes, an assassination might actually benefit, as they saw it at least, may have benefited a bunch of different people and agencies who wanted him gone. And I think that's an important thing to note, that it's not sort of one entity that did this. There could be multiple people who wanted him gone. Certainly, there was a whole issue of JFK wanting to pull out of the Vietnam War, and he wanted to break up the CIA and the intelligence community, and so many people did not want that. And there were people in Cuba that were for Kennedy, and others who were not for Kennedy. So, when you put all those pieces together, that to me is sort of the beginnings of a conspiracy, because it's just not straightforward and there's so much suspicious activity surrounding it.
Didn't at one point in time, I'm going to say fairly recently, but it was not fairly recently, someone stepped forward and say that he was one of the people that were like on the grassy knoll or on the overpass from the street, and was one of the people that shot?
Well, a few people have come forward and make claims like that, and kind of ironically, I actually only live about 20 minutes from the grassy knoll. But it's kind of weird, because when I drive past it now, I don't really think about it. When I first time, I moved to Dallas, I was like, oh my God, this is where it all happened. But then after a few years, you literally don't think about it, which in one sense is kind of strange, But, when on this whole issue, it's difficult to put a picture together beyond the fact that when the picture doesn't really come together properly, and you've got, this person and that person, and they're tied to somebody else, you can pretty much guarantee that there's something going on beyond just like a lone gunman.
Okay.
As far as I consider it all, anyway. So.
Mm-hmm. And I agree with you about the whole Dallas thing. I remember when I first moved to Dallas, and I was waiting for an apartment to open up, and I wasn't working, and blah blah blah. My first stop was the grassy knoll, and the assassination. It was the Conspiracy Museum.
Oh yeah, that. Unfortunately, that got shut. Well, not got shut down. I think, but it closed down a few years ago. And you've got the regular museum, but that's okay. But I mean, the Conspiracy Museum was a good one. Yeah.
Well, and he went over it from the whole conspiracy point of view, and had this whole discussion about the magic bullet, and and all the things that they just couldn't explain with that whole thing.
Well, there's a ton of material that doesn't really kind of, fit in well. I mean, you've got people like, for example, Guy Bannister, who was a former FBI agent, and he set up a private detective agency in New Orleans in the late 50s. And he was associated with Oswald, and he died suddenly from a heart attack. And you had Dorothy Kilgallen, one of the sort of deepest, really penetrating journalists of the 1950s. And she said that, she uncovered incredible data that she was going to put out there. And then she was found dead as well. So, there's a lot of weird stuff surrounding the Kennedy assassination that basically revolves around death, without being negative and, just looking at it from a very negative aspect. The fact is, a lot of people surrounding that case did end up dead.
But it seems like if there is something controversial, and obviously we have so much more to talk about, so I don't want to spill too many beans, but if there's something controversial going on, that people seem to just come up dead. Of natural or unnatural causes, or, jumping off buildings or something weird. Anyway.
Yeah, you're right, and there's so many strange things like this throughout history, and particularly the last 50, 60, 70 years, so many stories of, he jumped out of a building, or, he put a hose in the, the exhaust of the car and died of carbon monoxide, or, just took their lives for whatever reason, or they drowned in the sea, or they, fell off a cliff and so on. I mean, it's like, how many times can this happen,
Well, when I was asking you a little earlier about that Thomas Falls are not, oh man, I have such bad phonics, the commander of the 21st Space Wing. But in the same week, we had the Chinese ambassador to Israel, Du Wei, also died of natural causes, and he used to be the ambassador to the Ukraine. Kind of coincidental that he's gone too. So I don't know, just too much.
I mean, I get a lot of stories like that, and breaking news stories, and I think you can look at. I mean, for all the sort of conspiracies I've looked into, I still try and stay grounded, and I think the whole Space Force thing, and the guy dying. I mean, at some point we're all going to die, I mean, I hope I live a long time, but, if sort of in the future from now, there's a news story, Nick Redfern dies at 97, there's always going to be somebody who says, well, he was
of COVID-19.
Yeah, and, if somebody says sort of, 50, 60 years from now, there's a headline, Nick Redfern dies as he writes his latest book on Roswell. There's always going to be somebody who says, well, they kind of knocked Nick out, and that was it. And so, in other words, we do need to be careful between what is a genuine conspiracy and the fact that just somebody died who happened to work for the government. You know what I mean? It doesn't necessarily mean that it's always a direct connection. So I think we do need to be sort of mindful of that. I mean, I've seen so many times where people have died in ufology, and because they died in ufology, well, there's got to be a sinister reason. It can't just be a regular situation. But sometimes, we're all human, so it could actually, in some cases, be just a regular tragic event. And so, I'm not trying to play it down, but the fact is we are all human, right. And at some point we're going to toddle off to wherever, and but that doesn't always mean that there's a sinister reason. But sometimes there could be, and that's not me standing on the fence. It's just how it is, Some people who've investigated, like Roswell, for years, they're still at it. 20 years from now, when they sort of shuffle off, well, I'm sure there's going to be someone who said, oh, well, he got too close to the truth of Roswell. So you do have to be kind of balanced, between the two scenarios.
I do think, all right, so I just finished watching Game of Thrones last week, and it just seems that in the olden days, even though that was a fictitious story, obviously, but, you can watch any of these stories, the Middle Ages or whatever, and they didn't really need conspiracy theories because if they didn't like somebody, at least according to the TV, they would just go up and shove a sword in them. It was pretty straightforward. And it's like, oh, yeah, so-and-so killed him. Oh, okay, moving on. Now it just seems like so much more cloak and dagger and, have to keep it a secret.
Well, I mean, I've never actually watched Games of Thrones, but you're right. I mean, there was times, particularly sort of like in the Egyptian era and the Roman era, they were killing each other left, right, and centre. Somebody didn't like this Caesar or this Pharaoh, or what are they going to do? Oh, just kill him, that kind of thing. And I guess back then, things were civilization was very different back then to this day. But yeah, you're right. If you look back in history, there was all sorts of manipulations and conspiracies, and somebody ends up beheaded in the castle, or somebody just vanishes. You don't see him again, So we're not seeing, if you go back 3,000 years, sort of ancient Egypt and so on, we're not really seeing too much that's different from 2020. We kind of still see mysterious deaths to this very day.
We've evolved so much.
True. Or not.
So, Nick, I don't know if you know this, but today is the day that Marilyn Monroe sang happy birthday to JFK. And, she's also tied to her own conspiracy theory, where the party line says that she had a drug overdose, which sounds like it's possible, knowing her history. But then there's, again, all of this controversy around her. What's with that?
Well, a lot of it kind of depends who you ask. But one of the things I would point out, kind of, that parallels Lee Harvey Oswald is that Marilyn Monroe was connected with a lot of people, just in the same way that Lee Harvey Oswald, just as JFK was. And I've actually got a big poster of Marilyn Monroe on my wall. I didn't realize today was actually the sort of happy birthday, Mr. President. I won't try and say it, I'll sound stupid, but the the way she sung it anyway, And but she was someone who, was arguably someone who was really ripe for surveillance. Now, a lot of people, and certainly have suggested, and, other people have noted that she was just this sort of ditzy blonde, but she actually wasn't. She was extremely intelligent, and she was extremely well read. And in the 1950s, she actually applied to get a visa to travel to Russia because she actually wanted to know what Russia really was like. She'd read about it, but her approach was, well, I want to see it for myself. And she applied for the visa, but she ultimately didn't follow through. But she also, people have said she'd had this diary of secrets where she kept all the information that people like Robert Kennedy and JFK had told her. And they basically told her all these government secrets to sort of lure her into the bedroom. And but the interesting thing is that there wasn't just one sort of diary of secrets. All the information that she'd picked up from the Kennedys and people in the world of politics and Hollywood, where there was kind of like a crossover, it was clear, that she had to have more than just one journal. And, she died under circumstances that were sort of very controversial and suspicious in August 1962. She was found dead, and there are rumors of the body having been moved. that her diaries had been removed and vanished and were never seen again. And again, when you've got these kind of situations where it's not cut and dry, but there are other people involved, that's another classic example of, how these situations occur. I mean, to give you a good example, not to sort of make things dangerous for me, but I mean, I've got journals, sort of like 200-page journals, going back to like 1986, and now we're in 2020, and I've got mountains of journals of the most bizarre, secret stuff that people have shared with me, and stories about UFO cases and bizarre murders. Come into my office one day, you'll see like 25 to 30 journals, each one about 300 pages, chronicling practically my entire life from the age of about 23 to now.
So if Nick Redfern dies suddenly of natural causes, we know what's going on.
Somebody's going to grab all those journals.
But see, now it's already out there on air, so we know that they should be there. And if they're missing, you're going to be the work of somebody's book.
I probably shouldn't have said that, really, but I mean, it's like, what the hell?
Anyway, so we did get a question from the chat room, and I can't pronounce the person's handle, so I'm not going to. So here's the question, and it's about John Lennon, and it was, well, do you think that John Lennon was a political assassination also? Or, to cover up secrets also?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there's no doubt whatsoever that, the death of John Lennon was a very tragic one. I mean, music, rock bands, rock stars, I mean, they have gigantic followings. And, I mean, when, somebody in the music community dies, I mean, it's a huge thing. In the same way somebody in the realm of Hollywood, a famous actor dies, because people kind of view, famous people almost as immortal. Well, there's no way that person can die, you know what I mean? That kind of scenario. But in relation to John Lennon, one of the primary reasons, with John Lennon, he was a big advocate of the idea of getting out of the Vietnam War. Now, if it was just like your next door neighbor just talking about this, well, I think, John's got good views and ideas, and we should listen to him. That's just one thing. But when you've got a rock star who has millions of followers, and not just millions of followers, but millions of followers who follow his words, and possibly the most perfect example would be like, the song Imagine, which talks about, almost like if you read the lyrics, it's almost like, a communist state, we're all on the same level together, no need for money, etc., etc. That is very much a political song. It's a great song. Mm-hmm. I mean, mainly I like punk music. That's what I'm into. But I mean, nobody can. I don't think anybody would deny that Imagine is like one of the best songs ever written. With the lyrics as well. But the fact is that John Lennon had a huge following, and when you have someone who has the ability to manipulate the mindsets of millions of people through music, then you can easily see why somebody might see that person as a threat to national security. Now, what we know for sure is that, John Lennon was shot and killed in December 1980 by Mark Chapman. And, the big question is, did he just do it?
One of the really sad things about the whole Lennon shooting was that he had just come out with a new album that was excellent, and then that happened. But Nick, we need to go take another break.
Okay.
I'm Dr. Rita Louise. You're listening to Paranormal Now. We are talking to Nick Redfern. His book is Assassinations, the Plots, Politics, and Power Behind History-Changing Murders. And we'll be back with Nick after these words from our sponsors.
You tuck it in the middle of the winter cold, and I've gone cold.
Something strange is happening on May 30th. Rogue Planet presents All the Strange 2020, a virtual online expo highlighting and celebrating UFOs, extraterrestrial life, ghosts, Bigfoot, all the strange. Join us on May 30th as we showcase a series of fun presentations delivered by a lineup of awesome humans who are fascinated by the strange. And get this, All the Strange 2020 is a 100% free event. So jump over to allthestrange.com and register now.
You listen to us, and we listen to you. And so does the CIA. KGRAradio.com.
Hello and welcome back to Paranormal Now. I'm Dr. Rita Louise, your host for the night, filling in for Alan B. Smith, and welcome back to the second hour of the show. We've been here talking about conspiracy theories with my good friend Nick Redfern and kind of focusing in on his book, Assassinations, the Plots, Politics, and Power Behind History-Changing Murders. Anyway, Nick, we've kind of talked about JFK, Marilyn Monroe, and I want to touch on one more high-profile conspiracy theory, and it's Princess Di, because I feel like of all the people that kind of in politics that have died, she's the saddest one because I feel like she didn't really deserve it because she just seemed like a really kind and loving person.
Well, you're right. I mean, her death in 1997 was a shocking event for everyone, and particularly in the UK, because she was really kind of very different, to the whole royal family, so to speak. She was very much on the fringes and didn't sort of go along with what she was expected to go along with, I guess, really, more than anything else. But when you look into her death, it was a very strange situation. There's no doubt about that at all. And what was particularly, intriguing, and this sort of again gets into the realm of conspiracy, is the fact that it became clear a year or two before she was killed that she was under surveillance by British intelligence, and that would be like, for example, MI5, which is like the equivalent of the FBI in the UK, and also GCHQ, the government's communication headquarters, which is the UK equivalent of the National Security Agency in the United States. And the intriguing thing is that she was being watched for a long time because she was actually actively demanding that landmines on the battlefield should be removed. So she actually got involved in sort of war-based situations and what various countries were doing. But most important of all, she really kind of tipped the royal family on its head, so to speak, in the sense she felt that one of the big problems with the British royal family, and she was quite correct, was that they were very sort of aloof, and we're paying for their taxes, et cetera, et cetera. But, we're sort of expected to uphold this old family that's been around for centuries and that really have become nothing more than like a tourist attraction. And she wanted, what Princess Diana wanted to do was to become more open and visible to the general public, and become more on a similar level where you didn't feel you could not talk to these people. And of course, it all came to a shuddering end in 1997 when she died in France. And everybody knows the basic story of that. But there are a lot of weird things where there were rumors that possibly the car that she was in had been remotely taken over, sort of remotely controlled, and that may have caused it to sort of provoke like a head-on collision, and that led to her death, and which is going to head-on collision at a high speed. You're going to be in a dicey situation. Kind of as an aside, when I was like 17. It was that classic situation, just passed my driving test in the UK, thought I was sort of, knew everything about cars, and I had a head-on collision which shattered my entire jaw and face, and luckily they managed to fix it all up. But I mean, it made me think afterwards, that that was a relatively low speed, and thankfully nobody other than me. I was the only one who was injured, thank goodness. And it kind of, on a different angle, it made me respect, never do anything like this again, and I never have. I've always been a very careful driver, and as I said, thankfully nobody was hurt but me. But, if you've got like a car that is being sort of remotely taken over, and technology exists now, where, like, for example, the police, they're chasing a burglar, a thief, whatever, a murderer, they can actually slow the car down, if they can be hooked into the system and bring it to a halt. And you can also do the exact difference, the idea of, possibly orchestrating this head-on collision, where you've got Princess Diana and Dodi and the driver, and the security guy in the vehicle, and then they just slam into this post, and there's just carnage, but what's intriguing is that Princess Diana, before her death, did actually say, she wrote it down in one of her journals, that she said that the royal family was trying to find a way to kill her, probably in a car accident. That's a fact. That statement was made before she was dead, and she ended up exactly like that, dead in a car accident. And the car that supposedly collided with her car was found out, burned out, with no evidence that could be analysed. It was just sort of, burned to the ground. And we know that GCHQ, the UK equivalent of the NSA over here, we know for a fact that they have extensive files on surveillance files on Princess Diana, but there's no chance of that ever being declassified.
And to me, with Princess Diana, it seems like of all of the people that we've talked about so far, it was very convenient for her to go away. I know that sounds terrible, but it was like she was kind of bad press for the royal family.
Well, she was, but a lot of that was the British royal family's fault, because particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, a lot of people really got sort of angry at the royal family, because a lot of people may not realise that the funding of the British royal family largely comes from two issues. One is tourism, and the other one is actually out of the UK people. A lot of it comes out of the from the UK people. In other words, it sort of comes out of their taxes. We pay, the UK population go towards paying for the UK royal family, and a lot of people quite understandably said, well, why should we be paying for them? And Diana recognised that there was this growing division between the public and the royal family, and something had to be done about it. And I think she did it in the best way, and that was to go out into the streets and just literally hang out, with people and say hi, and speak to them and chat with them, and the royal family then became more approachable. And Diana, there's no doubt, achieved that. And I think had she not died, it would almost be as if she was on the level as everybody else. She was very down to earth. But, her boyfriend at the time of her death, Dawdi Fayed, was a Muslim. And one of the theories is that the British royal family just did not want, her to get married to a Muslim, and the two boys, would be essentially brought up by her and a Muslim. And so that was one of the big conspiracy theories, that the royal family would never allow something like that to happen.
Well, yeah. I have to tell you, when that whole thing happened, I had just moved to Texas, and it was probably 6 weeks after the whole incident that I found out that she was dead. Because I didn't have a TV, didn't listen to the news, didn't know anything. And I was at an event, a trade show, and people were talking about it. And I'm like, she's dead? Really? No clue. But I have to ask you a question. The police are actually able to stop or slow down cars, if they get into the onboard stuff? I mean, I know that, if you have like Star, whatever, or that Star Navigator, whatever, you can call them up and they can get into your car. But police actually have access or can gain access to that technology also?
Well, they can, but I'm not sure. I've got to be honest, I don't know if that was achievable back in 1997. 1997 is almost a quarter of a century now. Yeah. So I'm not entirely sure if that could have been achieved back then.
I'm just meaning now because, I'm a little bit of a privacy person. It's like, I don't want people like getting into my car, knowing my location, having my email address. It's like, I don't want you to know. So
well, that's right. I mean, there are, significant ways and means. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, today, certain cars, with certain systems can be brought to a complete shuddering halt. The police have the ability to do that. That's a part and parcel of today's technology. But in terms of the possibility of, remotely controlling Diana's car or the chauffeur's car is interesting, because a lot of people may not know this, but just before she got killed, that particular car was stolen. And one of the theories is that it was sort of, the changes had been made, if you like, to the car, to the point where it could have been almost sort of, if you like, radio controlled. That was one of the very suspicious aspects, that the car that she was in allegedly had problems, and those problems caused it to be taken into a garage for repair, or for several garages, and then the theory is that maybe something was done to allow the driver, if you like, or not allow the driver, prevent the driver from driving as normal, and the car actually being taken over, and hits the accelerator, hits the pole, and, there's just death everywhere. So.
Well, and, if this came from the highest levels of the government, so to speak, they would have access to the latest and greatest technology if it was available.
Well, that's right. And I mean the royal family, extremely powerful, body of people, and just the fact that Dawdi Fayed, as a Muslim, and had they not killed, I'm sure they probably would have, got married. And what would the British royal family say about the fact that, the two children brought up by Diana and possibly in partially a Muslim kind of environment? The theory is that they just would not even consider that, So, I mean, who knows? I mean, I think the Diana story is very much like JFK. There's so many people involved, different threads and leads and connections, and it's pretty much on that kind of level as well. You've got a president killed, and you've got Diana married to Prince Charles. It's almost in many respects it's kind of very similar because of the incredible visibility of the people who were killed,
So we're going to be shifting gears here, but I have one question before I move on to a different area. So in your book, okay, and you can answer this question, hopefully it won't get you killed, but you don't mention the Clintons in there at all.
Well, I mean, it was one of these...
Or is that a whole other book by itself?
Well, that's true. Yeah, I mean, actually, that is part of it because the company who I write for, or one of them who published this one, Visible Ink Press, all of their books have to be 150,000 words and roughly 400 pages. I mean, that is how sort of strict they are. And so it was really one of these situations where, I could only cover so many situations and killings and mysterious deaths, etc. And what I didn't want to do was to sort of cram it all into like the 80s and the 90s or in the 50s and 60s. I literally wanted to go from like the pharaohs of Egypt, Julius Caesar. What I wanted to do was to sort of make like a smooth situation going from centuries ago right to now, rather than suddenly have a cluster of material in one area. So that's why, I try to present the whole book from the perspective of looking at numerous cases, but as I said, not sort of clustering it up in one particular era. So in other words, something had to go.
So with that said, will you be coming out with a book on a kind of similar vein about the Clintons, or is that just too politically charged for you?
No. I mean, I've done a lot of books over the years, something about 55, 56, something like that. And I always, if I've got enough significant new material to warrant, a new book that might sort of expand much further on something that I've done in a previous book, I will do that. I'm quite open to doing that. But I've always been of the position that, I don't feel it's right to just sort of recycle things over and over again just for the sake of it, So for me to sort of write something about a previous subject that I've extensively written about as well, I probably wouldn't do that unless there was like a real, something that was really amazing that warranted me to do that. I just kind of try and avoid from going over the same old thing unless I've got something really extensive and new to talk about. So.
Well, then I guess I missed that book, Nick. So for the listeners, since I'm asking, and if they're interested in reading on that subject, what book would that be in?
On what subject?
The Clintons.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. No, I didn't explain that properly. What I meant was I actually didn't even touch the Clintons, particularly within the 80s era, because I'd got so much other material on the 80s and strange deaths anyway. So in other words, I didn't really touch on that at all. So.
Okay, so I'll go back to my original question. So is it something that you'd end up writing a book about? Because, kind of in the same vein, there's a lot of death and dying
again,
that's
probably
around
not.
them.
Mainly because, that particular subject of the Clintons has actually been done on a number of occasions in books. And I feel that if somebody's written, an extensive, detailed book on one particular subject, and it's really definitive, I don't really feel that I should do something along those lines, because I'm just going to kind of essentially copy what somebody else has done. I don't really want to do that. I prefer to make my work, sort of original. And, I don't really want to kind of just, go over things that people are going to read the book and think, well, hang on, I read this in somebody else's book, and I read that second part in someone else's book. I don't like to do that, So in terms of some of the cases that previously I've never covered, or that I have covered, I would probably just stick to things that I could just genuinely bring something really brand new, to the table.
Fair enough. So, Nick, I'll say this to the listeners. So, guys, this book is just loaded with material. And I have this list, and I'm like going, God, where do I want to go next? And this was just a small subset of the data that's in this book. It's amazing. So I think where I want to go next, let's talk about false flag events. So I'm going to start with this question. What is a false flag event, and why have them?
Well, are you still there?
Yep, I'm still here.
Oh, okay. Okay. A false flag basically is a situation where the blame on an event is put on somebody who actually wasn't the culprit. In other words, the idea that some terrible event occurs or somebody is murdered, and the finger is pointed to this person or those people, but it's done so in a way to guarantee that they are shown to be the people that orchestrated it, when reality a sort of bogus story is created to make people think that it was actually somebody else.
So it seems like that there have been a lot of false flag events that have, or what have been identified as false flag events, but there was some kind of an agenda tied to either allowing an event to happen, as an example, which is in the book, like Pearl Harbor. They knew that there was going to be some kind of attack, but chose not to do something with the thought that, well, this will bring the United States into the war. So it seems like when they happen, there's always some kind of an agenda or goal tied to them.
Well, yeah, you're right. And certainly, the Pearl Harbor allegations are extremely controversial, and you have to sort of be very careful how you dissect the stories, because there are different angles. And of course, you have people have the conventional scenario that, Japan just, it was a secret decision to sort of attack Pearl Harbor, and then in a worst case scenario, they achieved it, a terrible situation. I mean, literally thousands of people, killed, a terrible scenario. And then you have the situation, as you just painted, that some researchers think basically that nobody knew this was going to happen, or it was deliberately kept from them. Now, if anybody did, sort of hide the fact that the Japanese were about to attack, I mean, that would have been one of the most terrible acts in American history. The idea of, we're not going to say anything, we're going to allow this to happen because it will give justification to get into the Second World War. If that's true, then, we don't know it's true, but a lot of people do adhere to that angle. If it was true, that would be one of the most sort of obscene, terrible situations, kind of on a level with 9/11. You know, some people think that 9/11 was allowed to happen, and again, I mean, those people who do believe that would probably take the same kind of approach. You know, that this was a terrible inside event. But again, it depends really which side of the coin, so to speak, that you're on. But I mean, that kind of defines what a false flag is. The idea of creating a situation as a means to make it look like it was done by somebody else, and as a means to, sort of politicize something or change the world stage by provoking one of these false flag events.
With what you're saying, it makes me think of things like Sandy Hook, where that event happened, and I'm not contesting the veracity of the event, even though there are some people that said that it never happened, and those shows got taken down off my YouTube page because it was fake information. But the net result of that event, regardless, was this huge cry to take away the guns, which was met with huge opposition.
Well, you're right. I mean, again, this is where, with the false flag scenario, whether it's 9/11 or whether it's Pearl Harbor or Sandy Hook, what you always really find is typically just two scenarios: the people who accept the down-to-earth scenario, and those who believe a specific second scenario, which usually has at its heart, something which will prompt a change in society. And then you mentioned the whole issue of guns being brought into the equation, and I guess a lot of it is really dependent upon your own mindset, as to whether you, me, or somebody else believes this or somebody else believes something else. It is very much, these so-called false flags, it very much is driven by personal opinion. And that's why it becomes, so confusing, to try and get to the heart of these things. So, but there's no doubt that particularly in the last few years, the issue of false flags has grown and grown. The idea, well, this is another false flag and another false flag. But again, it depends whether you to buy into that or you don't,
Well, and I've heard some people suggest that a false flag event might happen because now the media has their attention over on their left hand, kind of like a magician, while there's some nefarious activities happening in the right hand that they don't want you to see because it never makes the news, because the news is overwhelmed addressing this false flag event. What's your thought on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's sort of one of the scenarios that often sort of pops up as well. And I think at least part of it, is due to sort of, the way society is now. We're almost sort of driven to not always believe that what the media says, or not to believe what politicians say. And people quite understandably find themselves in a situation not sure who they should listen to and what the truth is, or what the truth isn't. And I think, the more society progresses, the more we're seeing, just every day, in the news, there's something where you think, well, is that real or not? And I mean, there's this ridiculous word that's sort of developed in the last couple of years called falsehoods. That's one of the most annoying words out there. Somebody said a falsehood. This person said a falsehood. That person said a falsehood. What should we actually be doing? He's calling these people liars, for what they are. That they're not purveyors of falsehoods. They're lying scum. And regardless of who you direct those words to, whether it's in the UFO field or the conspiracy field, the fact is that we live in a world where we don't know what is true and what isn't, and that inevitably sort of rolls over into the field of false flags and conspiracies, because in the last couple of years we've reached a position where the world of truth and the world of lies and fiction have incredibly quickly all sort of melted into one, and you just don't know what to believe or who to believe.
And that's really sad. It used to be that the news was our source of truth, but then the news media kind of gets themselves. Some of these stories that I've seen, especially with relation to this whole COVID-19 thing, is, they were showing footage of a New York hospital emergency room, and there were people in the hallway and tubes and wires, and it was just, bad, only to find out that the film footage came from an Italian hospital, not New York. Oops. Or there is another one that was CBS, I think, who showed a testing site somewhere, Ohio. I don't remember what the city was. And Project Veritas went in after and was chatting it up with the people there, and they said, oh yeah, CBS was here, but there weren't enough people in line, so some of the nurses went and got in their cars and got in line, so it made it look like we were busy, so they would have a really good news story. And then CBS had to turn around and admit that they had kind of doctored the footage. And so it's like, well, you want us to believe you, but then you do stuff like that.
Well, what all this kind of points is towards a growing kind of almost 1984 kind of situation, and I think it's something we need to be extremely aware of, and get our points as well. Also, the tragic side would be, and the worst scenario would be, if we get to the point where people just don't care. That would be the worst scenario ever. That's okay. Well, I just don't care. I'll watch the TV and watch shows and play, watch a game, but don't bother me with what's going on in the real world. That would be the worst scenario possible.
Well, and the best scenario would be that they would tell the truth and have it be real and not be so biased, especially with both of us, I kind of touched on this earlier, coming out of the alternative thought area. It would be nice, of people not looking at us like we're nut jobs or what we think is wrong or different or not acceptable. And as in the case that we talked about at the very beginning, like UFOs, is not true, which they're finding out it is true, that there is something to it.
Well, I think the important thing is for everybody in the world to sort of sit up and take notice. And if you don't like something, and you feel something's wrong, well, tell everybody about it. Promote it on social media here and there. I don't see there's anything wrong with that at all, because otherwise there's a potential, 50 years from now that history might have been erased, This never happened, that didn't happen, and kids are taught that this or that didn't happen, and, it's the world, if you look at just since sort of February of this year, look how much the world has changed so quickly from February, end of February-ish, thereabouts, to May. We've gone from being, a regular, normal society to a situation where we're all wandering around in masks and worried about talking to other people in the streets. You avoid people, don't leave your home, all this business. We do have a legitimate, situation. There's no doubt about that. But my point is that how easy and how quickly society can be changed by quite literally out of the blue, situations which we find ourselves in now. And the same kind of thing could happen in the future, a complete change around in society and the way in which we work. Who would have thought 4 months ago that, the airlines of the world were, some of them could be on the verge of almost, financial collapse. And who would have thought 4 months ago that you would have millions of people thinking, if somebody told you 4 months ago that people would be frightened to get on planes, you'd say, what? But now people are frightened to get on planes. They're frightened to even get in the checkout line at the local store. 4 months ago, people would say, what are you just talking nonsense? So, it does demonstrate how easy, whether deliberately or not, society can be manipulated at an incredibly quick time frame,
And I think that statement is very true and very scary at just how quickly the world has been changed. And, I like that manipulated word, personally.
Well, when I say manipulated, I'm not saying that everything is manipulated. Even, I'm not even saying that that sort of COVID is a manipulation. What I'm saying is that we as a human race are very easily manipulated, and it doesn't necessarily...
And I agree.
It doesn't always mean there's a conspiracy or there's a situation, I think what we're seeing now is a terrible situation, with more and more deaths. And if you look back, to 1918, we had the Spanish flu, which killed round about 30 million people. And that was right on the back of the First World War, which also killed millions of people. So ironically, I'm not a big believer in the idea that what we're seeing now is some sort of New World Order conspiracy. But I am someone who recognizes how quickly society can be controlled. But if you go back to the Middle Ages, as I said, you've got the Black Plague. Were all these pandemics going back to 1918 with Spanish flu and the Middle Ages in Europe, which killed millions and millions with the Black Plague. Sometimes, pardon my language, but, shit happens. That's a well-worn phrase, Sometimes bad things happen just because bad things happen, But on other occasions it happens because something's orchestrated. But the way we are right now, I think we're just in a terrible situation that has occurred for whatever reasons. I don't know whether it was a conspiracy or it's just a terrible situation of nature or something like that. I honestly don't know. I actually don't have sort of like a particular position in this scenario, other than the fact that it has radically altered society.
And one of the reasons why I thought that your book was so timely is, one of the things that you talk about in it, which kind of ties in with the COVID thing, is the concept of AIDS, and anthrax and, these diseases where the conspiracy part of it says that they were released on the population, or they try to release it on the population to, kill us
Well,
in
yeah,
big swarthing, attacks.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you actually look into the history of AIDS, for example, before the fall of the Soviet Union occurred at the end of the late 1980s, that Russia was basically a collection, I should say, of what was known as the Soviet Union. And we know that in the latter part of the 1980s, the KGB began spreading bogus stories that AIDS was created by U.S. intelligence, which I should stress, I don't believe that at all. However, the Soviet Union, Soviet intelligence, spread that story, and that became, within the conspiracy research field, quite sort of a widespread believed scenario that AIDS was sort of an attempt to lower the population and to make the population more controllable and things like that. And so, in other words, you can find examples throughout history where pandemics and things like AIDS have actually been the subject, and particularly with the Russians, as a means to sort of seed stories which actually weren't true, and eventually the Russians Russian intelligence admitted that yes, they did create this story that the US was responsible for AIDS, when, as I said, I don't believe that at all, but the Russians did try to spread that scenario. So, there's a lot of situations have come into play in relation to, creating stories that suggest, that maybe why somebody today, it's quite easily to understand why somebody today might think that, the whole situation now was coldly and calculatingly, performed to the position where we are now,
Well, and I think it is interesting with that story that, there was a rumor that got started, and the rumor was, taking on the form of reality, and then we have who we see as the trusted sources telling things that aren't reality. And so I think it just leaves people with this sense of, and you mentioned this earlier, I don't know what to believe. I don't know who's telling me the truth. What's the real data here, and what should I believe? Who should I believe? And we're left with uncertainty, which I think is more toxic than anything else.
Well, you're right. I mean, that issue of who or how, should we believe this or believe that? I mean, we can go back a few weeks and the whole disinfectant controversy, I mean, that's a perfect example of, how almost like a meme develops, about this. And it was sort of huge coverage for days on the news. And then, something else pops up, why not try this? Why not try this drug? Why not try that drug? Well, maybe I won't try it because it actually hasn't been, sort of fully tested. So, when you kind of look at these situations, what I think we're living in now is almost like a surreal world. It's like common sense in many respects seems to have gone out of the window, and just such bizarre situations occur, and just tragic situations, just endless and mindless shootings, I mean, we didn't live like that 20 years ago, and it's like something has just changed society,
There's part of me that thinks, I'm kind of glad that I'm getting kind of old. And I don't really have to do this much longer. I mean, unless I have a good conspiracy and they want to come after me and knock me out because, I'm super famous or something, which that ain't happening this week. So let's see. What do I want to do? So do you believe there's any truth to the whole concept of, like the Georgia Guidestones and this whole notion of population control, and I guess that whole concept, has been kind of tied to Bill Gates and, his whole vaccine thing. But do you think that there is anything real about that whole conspiracy about population control?
Well, I mean, I have to, as I said, as you noted, I have sort of, addressed this, like in radio shows and things like that and debates. I guess the big problem that I have with all of this is the fact that how big the population is now. We're talking about, 7, 8 billion, that kind of thing. And but there's no doubt. I mean, you can look at some, particularly from the 1970s, there's some very interesting United Nations reports where they were actually looking at ways and means to lower the population. Now, these weren't sort of, killing people off or anything like that. That's what I need to stress. But it was more about along the lines of, encourage people perhaps to just have one child and things like that, And so in that sense, government agencies have seriously looked at the idea that, if we keep growing and growing as a human population, that, if you look at the figures that are sort of guessed, if you like, from sort of 20 or 30, 40 years from now, 50 years, the figures that the United Nations were looking at were almost double the levels of the population now. And I'm not sure to what extent we as a species, or even the planet as a planet, could actually survive that kind of growth, an endless growth. We'll end up like kind of Soylent Green or something,
Mm-hmm.
But so, in other words, I don't personally think that there is a sinister group that is plotting to wipe out 5 billion people or something and then be able to control the remaining 3. But what I do think is that there's no doubt that what we're seeing right now is something that could happen again and again and again. And we need to find a way to control the problem, but not to the extent where we effectively become prisoners in our own home. There has to be sort of a middle ground where, yes, we need to tackle this issue, this virus, we need to get rid of it, but then we need to go, hopefully when we get rid of that, then we go back to regular society. This should not be the society of the future forever. It should be a situation where we tackle it, we beat it, and we go back to the extent that we can to normality. And the worst scenario could be that when it's over, that we continue with the laws and the regulations in case it comes back. I think we need to make a careful balance between becoming prisoners versus using common sense.
Mm-hmm. That makes total sense. I mean, I don't know that it will ever go back to where it was. Your comment about the airlines. I mean, I don't even like flying because whenever I fly somewhere, by the time I get home, I'm sick. I mean, that's just kind of standard operating procedure for me. And so now, there's even more concern because, there might be somebody with the next new virus or whatever out there.
Well, I mean, a good example, how everybody's kind of, a lot of people are sort of struggling right now, whether particularly with work, or somebody, a couple who've got 3 kids, that kind of thing. It must be sort of really kind of difficult, in those situations. And I mean, its impact on me in like an alternative fashion, in the sense that, most of the conferences and lectures that I had booked for this year have all been closed down, or, they are likely to be shut down. And certainly, I'm not doing any TV work, for any of the channels and so on, because, if they phone me up right now, I'm just going to say, look, I'm just not prepared to take a drive from where I live, to DFW Airport, which is just like 10 minutes drive from where I live. I'm just not prepared and willing to walk through DFW Airport filled with hundreds and hundreds of people, sit in a gate for 2 hours with hundreds of people, get on a plane with a packed plane, then get off at the other end at LAX or somewhere, go through another huge bunch of people, do the filming and come back. I'm just not going to risk it. So in other words, it may come to it that paranormal conferences and lectures, we may sort of see 10 months from now or a year from now, conferences may actually be all done via Zoom or Skype, rather than everybody turns up and sits in an audience of 300 people. I could easily see how that could happen, and for me, it's not done out of fear. It's done out of common sense. Why would I want to expose myself to 300 or 400 people, 500 people over the course of 2 flights and going through airports and terminals and gates, just to speak at a conference? It'd be much easier and safer. And maybe, 10 years later down the line, if issues are still going on, that could become normality, and which would be kind of disturbing, but, society changes, and sometimes the best, sometimes not for the best,
And see, for me, since all the hair salons have been closed down, I've been able to get my hair done, and there's not any way anyone's going to see me other than like the people at the local supermarket and Lowe's, me looking like this. So it's kind of like, no, you'll pay me a lot of money? Well, all right, maybe I could get a box of something and do my hair and get somebody to cut it, but yeah.
Well, shall I give you a perfect example of this? Just a couple of months ago, maybe.
Okay, and we only have 10 more minutes, so just.
All right, very quickly. A couple of months ago, a particular company asked me if I was willing to go on a cruise ship and give a couple of lectures for quite a tidy sum of money, and on a cruise ship. And this was after the whole virus thing had begun. And my response was like, not just no, but hell no. I'm not going to, I don't care what the fee is, I'm not going to get on a cruise ship right now, or last month thereabouts, or 6 weeks ago, whatever it was, and, head off to the Caribbean and then risk coming back and sorry, somebody on the ship's got the virus and you can't get off for the next 6 weeks, There's just no way I'm going to do that,
It wouldn't be a
book, listen to radio shows. Yeah.
It wouldn't be a 3-hour tour. It would be like a 4-month extravaganza.
Yeah, it would. And I think because the longer you're on that damn ship, it's like more and more people are going to get sicker and sicker. So I can easily see how key issues of society, which we don't really think about, would come to the fore. I mean, sort of to echo a little bit what I said earlier, I mean, 3 months ago, 4 months ago, if somebody said to you, you would be frightened or worried to go into your local supermarket for fear of catching something from somebody else's at the checkout, you would just say that, well, that sounds like The Walking Dead or something. But it's actually not The Walking Dead. It's actually the Walking Living,
Exactly. So, Nick, this book came out in April. So, Assassinations, the plot, politics, and power behind history-changing murders came out like just a month ago, if that long. Correct?
What's that?
Very recently? Your book, it just came out?
Oh, the new one. Oh, yeah. Well, this is It's called the Rendlesham Forest UFO Conspiracy. And the Rendlesham Forest case is kind of like the UK's equivalent of Roswell in the United States, in the sense that it's sort of one of the most visible UK-based UFO cases. And it all occurred in December 1980, when multiple US military personnel who were stationed in the UK at the time saw these sort of strange lights, UFOs and things like this. And I followed the story. I mean, when this actually happened in December 1980, you know, I was a kid at school, chalkboards and all that business. You know, I wasn't involved in research back then. As I said, I was still the UK equivalent of high school. But when the story broke out, I started to get into it. And the more I looked into it, the more it seemed to me that this was more like a secret experiment using like sophisticated holograms to essentially see how the human mind could be manipulated by things like holograms and hallucinogenic substances. And so that's the theme of the new book. It's sort of the dissecting of the UK's most famous UFO event, but presenting it as a top secret experiment. And of course, particularly in the UK, I've been practically branded as like the next worst thing since Saddam Hussein, for daring even to say that, the UK's most famous UFO case may have been...
So what's coming up next? We have 2 minutes left. What's coming up next for you?
All right. Well, the next one is in August, and it's one of my bigger interests, which is cryptozoology, and it's called Monsters of the Deep. So it covers things like sea serpents, lake monsters, giant squid, the legends of how the Kraken developed, and anything that's weird and monstrous lurking deep in the waters. And it's called Monsters of the Deep, and it's out in August.
Well, I'll have to tell Alan that he needs to just set up a cot for you so that, he can have you be on the show in August. So.
All right, that'll work. That'll be great.
Okay, we got 1 minute left. Nick, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about your new book, Assassinations, Plots, Politics, and Powers Behind History-Changing Murders. And so if people want to get it, where can they get it?
They can get it from Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It's available in paperback and Kindle. People can reach me at Facebook, just look in Nick Redfern. I also have a blog, World of Whatever, and you can reach me at Twitter at Nick Redfern UFO.
Great. Nick, thank you so much. It was so nice to hear your voice and get to hang out with you. But we need to wrap. It's been too long.
Yeah.
But we need to wrap it up. I'm Dr. Rita Louise. My webpage is soulhealer.com. I'm filling in for Alan B. Smith on his show Paranormal Now, and Alan will be back with you guys next week. So till then, be blessed.